Imagine boarding a flight, settling into first class, expecting comfort and exclusivity, only to find yourself at the center of a viral scandal before the plane even takes off. That's exactly what happened to Margaret Whitmore, a woman who thought a few carefully chosen words could remove someone she deemed out of place. But what she didn't realize was that her actions were being recorded. And when the truth came to light, the internet had a verdict of its own. Within hours, her name was trending, her reputation shattered, and the privilege she had always relied on was useless against the power of accountability. This story isn't just about one woman's downfall, it's about how quickly the world has changed, and how no one is immune to the consequences of their actions. If this story made you think, hit that like button. Tell us in the comments, do you think justice was served? And if you want more gripping real-life stories that reveal the power of truth, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. The next viral moment could happen anytime, and you'll want to be here when it does. Margaret Whitmore was a woman of means, accustomed to a life of privilege and exclusivity. At 62, she had spent decades climbing the social and corporate ladder, ensuring that every aspect of her life reflected success. Flying first class wasn't just a luxury for Margaret, it was an expectation, a given. From the moment she stepped into the airport, she moved with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. TSA pre-check, priority boarding, a glass of chilled champagne waiting at her seat, these were not indulgences, they were simply the way things were supposed to be. Margaret had always believed in the unwritten rules of first class: polished professionals, hushed conversations, a sense of quiet exclusivity. It was a space for those who had earned their place, and she took comfort in the familiarity of it. For her, flying wasn't just about travel, it was about maintaining a world that felt tailored just for her. As Margaret Whitmore approached her first-class seat, she expected the usual, an effortless transition into the quiet comfort she had come to associate with flying. But the moment she spotted the man seated next to her, something inside her tensed. He was young, well-dressed, and composed, but that wasn't what caught her off guard. It was the simple fact that he was a black man sitting in first class, as if he belonged there. She hesitated for just a second, her polished exterior barely wavering. Still, an unease settled in, a feeling she couldn't quite name but knew all too well. This wasn't how first class was supposed to feel. She had flown this route dozens of times and had never encountered this situation before. She set her designer handbag down with more force than necessary, smoothing her expression into polite neutrality. But inside, Margaret couldn't shake the thought, something about this just felt wrong. Margaret Whitmore settled into her seat, her polished nails tapping lightly against the armrest. She had convinced herself that this was just a minor inconvenience, a mistake that could easily be corrected. After all, airline mix-ups happened all the time. Maybe the young man beside her, what was his name again, had simply misread his ticket. With a composed smile, she caught the eye of a flight attendant making her way down the aisle. The woman, a blonde in her early 30s with a crisp uniform and an air of quiet efficiency, stopped by her row. "Excuse me, dear," Margaret said, her voice warm, practiced. "I believe there may have been a mix-up with the seating assignments." She gestured lightly toward the man sitting next to her, careful to keep her tone pleasant. "I just want to be sure everything is in order." The flight attendant pulled out her tablet, giving Margaret a polite but knowing smile. "Of course, ma'am. Let me check." Margaret waited, confident that this would be resolved in a matter of moments. The airline would see the mistake, reassign the young man to his correct seat, perhaps in economy, and restore the order she had expected. But when the flight attendant glanced back up, her response wasn't what Margaret had anticipated. "Actually, Mr. Carter is in his correct seat," she said. "Your ticket is for 2A, and he's in 2B. Margaret blinked, her carefully curated composure flickering for just a moment. "Are you sure?" she asked, laughing lightly. I just assumed. But the attendant was already nodding. Yes, ma'am. Everything is correct. Margaret smiled tightly and nodded, but inside, she was fuming. This wasn't over. Margaret Whitmore sat stiffly in her seat, her fingers drumming lightly against the armrest. She had flown first class for decades, always enjoying the comfort, the exclusivity, the quiet professionalism of those around her. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She had expected the flight attendant to handle the situation immediately, to recognize the mistake and make the necessary adjustments. Instead, she had simply confirmed that the man, Mr. Carter, was in his assigned seat, as if that settled the matter. But for Margaret, it didn't. She pressed the call button again, ignoring the sideways glances from nearby passengers. A soft chime rang overhead, and within moments, the flight attendant returned, her professional smile unwavering. "Is there something else I can assist you with, ma'am?" Margaret inhaled slowly, adjusting her posture before speaking. "I'd like to request a seat change," she said, her voice smooth but firm. The flight attendant tilted her head slightly. "Oh? Is there an issue with the seat itself?" Margaret hesitated for just a second before shaking her head. "No, it's not the seat," she said, choosing her words carefully. "I just don't feel comfortable." The flight attendant's polite smile flickered, just for a moment, before returning to its usual professional neutrality. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said. "I'd be happy to check if there are any open seats." She tapped her tablet, scanning the seating chart. Margaret nodded, folding her hands neatly in her lap. Of course, there would be an open seat. There was always an open seat. She had seen passengers reassigned for far less. But after a few moments, the flight attendant looked back up. "I'm afraid first class is at full capacity, ma'am. There are no open seats available." Margaret's stomach tightened. That wasn't the answer she had expected. "In an economy?" she asked, keeping her voice even. The flight attendant nodded. "There are 2 open seats in economy." Margaret straightened slightly, prepared to accept, until the flight attendant clarified, "Would you like to move there?" The words hit Margaret like a slap. She wasn't the one who should be moving. She was the one who belonged here. Her smile tightened. "That's not going to work," she said flatly. The flight attendant didn't argue, simply nodding once. "Then I appreciate your patience, ma'am. Let me know if there's anything else I can assist with." And with that, she walked away, leaving Margaret stewing in her seat. This wasn't over. Margaret Whitmore felt her patience slipping away. She had been calm. She had been reasonable. She had requested a simple accommodation, one that any reputable airline should have granted without hesitation. But instead, she had been told there were no available first-class seats and, even more insultingly, offered a seat in economy. As if she were the one who needed to move. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she exhaled sharply, her frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Clearly, being polite wasn't getting her anywhere. If the flight attendant wouldn't listen to a request based on comfort, perhaps she would take it more seriously if framed as something more urgent. Margaret pressed the call button again, this time with more force. The flight attendant returned, her expression still professional, though now tinged with something else, perhaps mild impatience. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret sat up straighter, lowering her voice as if she were sharing something sensitive. "I need to speak with someone in charge," she said. The flight attendant remained composed. "As I mentioned, ma'am, I am the lead flight attendant. What seems to be the issue?" Margaret let out a small sigh, carefully glancing toward Mr. Carter before looking back at the attendant. "I just don't feel safe," she said quietly. A moment of silence followed. The flight attendant's expression hardened, her polite demeanor shifting slightly. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said, her voice measured. "Could you clarify what you mean by that?" Margaret hesitated for just a moment, long enough to let the implication settle. She didn't need to say anything outright. The words had already done their work. "I'm not accusing anyone of anything," she said, tilting her head slightly. "I just have a feeling. I don't feel comfortable sitting here." Across the aisle, a businessman muttered under his breath. Another passenger subtly lifted their phone, recording. Margaret didn't notice. She was too focused on getting what she wanted. James Carter sat quietly, his hands resting on the keyboard of his laptop, the faint glow of the screen reflecting off his neatly pressed navy blue suit. He had heard everything, the clipped tone of the woman beside him, the pointed pauses, the carefully chosen words. None of it surprised him. He had been in situations like this before. The subtle glances. The carefully measured phrases that weren't outright accusations, but carried weight all the same. He knew how this worked. He knew the unspoken rules of these encounters. And so, he did nothing. He didn't fidget. He didn't shift in his seat. He didn't meet her gaze. He simply continued working, his fingers moving steadily across the keys. To any outside observer, it would have seemed as though he was unaware of what was happening, unaffected by the tension coiling beside him. But he was aware. He noticed the slight tremor in Margaret Whitmore's voice when she pressed the call button a second time. He heard the forced politeness, the barely contained frustration. And then, he caught the shift in her tone, the moment she went from uncomfortable to something far more dangerous. "I don't feel safe." James inhaled slowly through his nose, steadying himself. It wasn't the first time he had heard those words weaponized in this way. He knew what they could do. How quickly they could turn a situation from a mild inconvenience to something with real consequences. He also knew that reacting, really reacting, would only make it worse. So, he didn't. He let the words sit in the air, let the flight attendant process them, let the murmurs from the surrounding passengers spread. He felt the shift happening, the weight of it. And still, he remained calm. He reached for his laptop, slowly closing the lid. And then, for the first time, he looked directly at Margaret. And he waited. James Carter had been patient. He had remained calm, listening as Margaret Whitmore escalated the situation with every carefully chosen word. He had seen this playbook before, subtle at first, then more insistent, until finally, she dropped the phrase designed to cause real damage. "I don't feel safe." The moment the words left her lips, the air in the cabin shifted. The flight attendant stiffened. A businessman across the aisle let out a quiet, exasperated sigh. A few rows back, a woman raised her phone, pretending to text but clearly recording. James had been in enough situations like this to know what came next. A request for the pilot. A potential delay. Security waiting at the gate. And, if things spiraled far enough, the kind of headlines that could follow. So, before anyone else could speak, before Margaret could double down, he calmly reached into his suit pocket. The movement was deliberate, unhurried. He pulled out a small leather case, flicked it open, and held it up at chest level, where the gold FBI badge gleamed under the cabin lights. A beat of silence. Margaret's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The flight attendant's professional demeanor faltered, her gaze flickering between James and the badge. Across the aisle, the businessman let out a low chuckle. James tilted his head ever so slightly, his voice measured and smooth. "Would you like to file an official complaint, ma'am?" Margaret's breath hitched. The confidence she had just moments ago, the certainty that she was in control of this situation, was slipping. Passengers murmured, some smirking, others whispering to one another. The woman with the phone zoomed in. James held the badge steady, his expression unreadable. He had let this play out long enough. Now, it was her move. Margaret Whitmore felt the world tilt beneath her. For the past several minutes, she had been utterly convinced that she was in control of this situation. She had chosen her words carefully, played the game with the finesse of someone who had done this before. First, the subtle hints. Then, the polite but firm requests. And finally, the nuclear option, "I don't feel safe." It had always worked. Until now. Because now, James Carter wasn't just another passenger, wasn't just an inconvenience in the seat beside her. He was something far more dangerous to her narrative. He was an FBI agent. The badge gleamed under the soft cabin lights, its gold surface catching the flickering movement of the plane's interior. It was real. There was no mistaking it. She had seen enough movies, enough crime dramas, enough real-life headlines to know exactly what she was looking at. Her stomach twisted painfully. Her mouth went dry. Passengers around her were no longer pretending not to listen. A businessman across the aisle let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. A young woman a few rows back had lifted her phone, recording openly now. Margaret could hear the whispering, the unmistakable shift in the energy around her. This was not how this was supposed to go. She had expected quiet compliance. She had expected the flight attendant to take her side, to resolve this misunderstanding swiftly and efficiently. She had expected James Carter to shrink under the weight of her carefully placed words, to either apologize or, at the very least, remove himself from the situation. Instead, he had done none of those things. Instead, he had calmly, methodically, turned the tables on her in a way she had never anticipated. "Would you like to file an official complaint, ma'am?" His voice was smooth, steady. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't rattled in the way she had expected him to be. He was waiting. Margaret realized, with dawning horror, that there was no way out of this. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, the tingling in her fingertips. Her heart pounded so loudly in her chest that she could barely hear the steady hum of the airplane engines. For the first time in her life, Margaret Whitmore had no control over the situation in front of her. And everyone knew it. Margaret Whitmore could feel the weight of their stares. It had started subtly, furtive glances from the corners of eyes, slight shifts in posture as passengers around her began to take notice. But now, there was no pretense of discretion. People were watching. People were listening. And worst of all, people were recording. A businessman across the aisle, dressed in a navy blazer and slacks, smirked as he pretended to scroll through his phone. A woman a few rows ahead whispered something to her husband, shaking her head. And just behind Margaret, a young woman with dark-rimmed glasses had raised her phone ever so slightly, angling the camera in Margaret's direction. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a disagreement. This wasn't just an uncomfortable moment that would pass once the plane was in the air. This was something more. This was becoming a story. Margaret knew what that meant. She had seen it happen before, to politicians, to executives, to ordinary people who had made a mistake in the wrong place at the wrong time. A single video, a short clip, taken out of context but powerful enough to ruin a reputation. She had seen careers end, apologies issued too late, families dragged into public disgrace. And now, it was happening to her. The flight attendant was still standing there, waiting for Margaret's response. James Carter still had his badge out, his expression unreadable. And somewhere, beyond the walls of this airplane cabin, the internet was already stirring, waiting for its next scandal to unfold. Margaret clenched her jaw, resisting the urge to look directly at the cameras she knew were pointed at her. Did they know what she was thinking? Could they see the panic building just beneath her skin? A quiet chime overhead signaled an announcement from the cockpit. The flight would be departing soon. But for Margaret, it was already too late. The damage had been done. Margaret Whitmore had barely made it through the jet bridge when she felt the first vibration in her handbag. Then another. And another. She ignored it at first, focusing instead on getting out of the airport as quickly as possible. If she could just make it to the car service waiting for her outside, she could put some distance between herself and what had happened on that plane. But then her phone buzzed again. And again. The vibrations were rapid, insistent. Too many for a normal afternoon. A creeping sense of dread settled over her. She reached into her bag, her manicured fingers curling around the familiar weight of her phone. The second she pulled it out, the screen lit up, missed calls, text messages, and a flood of notifications. She hesitated, but curiosity and fear forced her thumb to swipe across the screen. The first text was from her sister. "Margaret. Please tell me this isn't you." The next was from a longtime friend. "Oh my God. What did you do?" Her stomach twisted as she tapped on a link someone had sent her. It opened to Twitter, except now, her name wasn't just in a private conversation. It was everywhere. Margaret Whitmore was trending. She scrolled, her breath catching in her throat. Her video, was spreading at an alarming rate. Entitled "Woman Tries to Kick FBI Agent Out of First Class. Racist Karen Learns the Hard Way." This is what happens when privilege meets reality. The view count had already passed 300,000 in less than an hour. People weren't just watching, they were commenting. "I have second-hand embarrassment just watching this. She really thought she could get away with it, didn't she? Hope she loses her job over this." Margaret felt like the air had been sucked out of the airport. The voices of travelers, the overhead announcements, the beeping of luggage carts, it all faded into a distant hum. She looked around wildly, as if someone might recognize her at any moment. No one had approached her yet, but that wouldn't last. Not when the video was still spreading. Not when reporters would inevitably catch wind of the scandal. This wasn't just a moment of embarrassment anymore. This was public humiliation, unfolding in real time, for the entire world to see. And there was no stopping it. Margaret Whitmore sat in the back seat of the black town car, gripping her phone so tightly that her fingers ached. The vehicle moved smoothly through Washington, D.C. traffic, but she barely noticed the familiar cityscape passing by. Her entire world was contained in the glowing screen in front of her. Her name, her full name, was everywhere. What had started as a viral video had now morphed into something much worse. At first, the clip had been shared with vague captions, entitled "Woman Tries to Remove FBI Agent from First Class" or "Another Karen Learns Her Lesson." But now, just hours later, people online had uncovered her identity. Margaret Whitmore. The name that had once been associated with charity events, high-profile fundraisers, and exclusive social circles was now plastered across every corner of the internet for an entirely different reason. Someone had found her LinkedIn profile. Someone else had posted a screenshot of an old magazine feature that highlighted her philanthropic work. And then, the real storm began. Her personal Facebook page, private for years, was suddenly flooded with hundreds of comments from strangers. People calling her a disgrace. People telling her she deserved to lose everything. Some were even digging through her past, searching for any misstep, any old quote that could be used against her. Twitter was worse. Margaret Whitmore is exactly the type of person who thinks the rules don't apply to her. She tried to destroy a man's life with a lie, and now she's facing the consequences. Hope she enjoyed that first-class ticket, because she just bought herself a one-way trip to unemployment. She scrolled through the posts, her breath coming faster. No one cared about context. No one cared about her side of the story. They had seen the video. They had made up their minds. Her name was trending alongside words like racist, privileged, and cancelled. Margaret's stomach churned. She had always believed that public scandals happened to other people, careless celebrities, corrupt politicians, reckless executives. Not her. Never her. But now, her reputation, her carefully cultivated life, was unraveling. And there wasn't a single thing she could do to stop it. As the wheels of the plane touched down at Reagan National Airport, Margaret Whitmore gripped the armrests, her pulse hammering in her ears. The flight had been agonizing. Every time she refreshed her phone, the numbers climbed higher. The video that had started as a quiet whisper in the online world had exploded into a deafening roar. 1.2 million views. She stared at the screen in disbelief. An hour ago, it had been 300,000, still shocking, but manageable. Now, her name wasn't just trending, it was everywhere. She scrolled through the latest headlines flooding social media. Woman tries to remove FBI agent from first class, backfires spectacularly. Margaret Whitmore's meltdown goes viral, a lesson in instant karma. Another day, another Karen, this time, it's a prominent DC socialite. Her breath hitched as she saw a new notification, someone had tagged her in a post. She tapped the link with a trembling finger. It was a screenshot from a live news segment. Coming up, the woman at the center of today's viral controversy has just landed in Washington, D.C. Stay with us for updates. Margaret's vision blurred. They knew she was on this flight. They were waiting for her. The seatbelt sign dinged, signaling passengers to disembark. Around her, people stood up, retrieving their carry-ons, chatting casually, as if nothing had happened. But Margaret knew better. She hesitated, dreading the moment she'd step off the plane. But there was no delaying it. Clutching her designer handbag, she took a deep breath and moved forward, her heels clicking sharply on the jet bridge floor. And then, she saw them. A cluster of reporters near baggage claim, microphones in hand, cameras poised, their eyes scanning the stream of passengers. One of them, a woman in a crisp navy blazer, checked her phone, then looked up, her gaze locking onto Margaret. Margaret froze. Wait, there she is. A ripple of movement. Cameras turned. Reporters surged forward. Questions flew. Ms. Whitmore, do you have a response to the viral video? Are you planning to apologize? Do you believe your actions were justified? Margaret felt lightheaded, her carefully controlled world crumbling around her. There was no escape. Margaret Whitmore had barely stepped into the back seat of the town car when her phone rang, again. She had ignored countless calls during the flight, but this one, she couldn't. The name on the screen made her stomach drop. James Rollins, Chairman, Whitmore Foundation. She swallowed hard, hesitating for just a second before answering. James, I. Margaret. His tone was clipped, cold. Not the familiar warmth she was used to. Not after today. I assume you've seen the video, she said, trying to sound composed. I don't think there's a person left in this country who hasn't seen the video, James replied flatly. It's everywhere. News outlets are running with it. Our donors have already started pulling their contributions. Margaret pressed her fingers to her temple, closing her eyes. James, this is being blown out of proportion. I can fix this. I can. You can't fix this, Margaret. The finality in his voice made her chest tighten. The board met an hour ago. We can't afford to be associated with this mess. She clenched her jaw. James, please, you know me. This isn't who I am. Doesn't matter, he said. It's who the world thinks you are now. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Margaret had spent decades building her reputation, carefully curating every aspect of her public image. She had chaired galas, sat on advisory boards, been a keynote speaker at high-profile events. She was the Whitmore Foundation. And now, it was gone. She gripped the phone tighter. "James, there has to be another way." "There isn't." He exhaled sharply. "We need your resignation by morning. If you don't step down, we'll remove you publicly." Margaret's breath hitched. She wanted to argue, to fight, to demand a second chance, but there were no second chances when the world had already made up its mind. "I understand," she said, her voice hollow. A pause. "Goodbye, Margaret." The line went dead. She lowered the phone, staring blankly ahead as the car rolled toward her gated neighborhood. Her life as she knew it had collapsed in less than a day. And there was no coming back from it. Margaret Whitmore had spent a lifetime believing that the world operated by a certain set of rules, rules that had always worked in her favor. She had learned, consciously or not, that people like her could maneuver through life with a quiet kind of power, making situations bend to their comfort with nothing more than a well-placed sigh, a strategic complaint, or a pointed glance. But the world had changed. Once upon a time, an incident like this might have remained confined to whispers among a small circle of travelers, a brief anecdote shared over dinner, then forgotten. Not anymore. Because now, the world had smartphones. It had cameras in every pocket. It had instant uploads, viral shares, and global conversations happening in real time. And in this world, the world of Twitter trends and 24-hour news cycles, actions had consequences. Margaret hadn't understood that at first. Not when she pressed the call button the first time. Not when she escalated the situation with her careful words. She had thought she was controlling the narrative. Instead, she had walked straight into her own downfall. The young woman 3 rows back had captured the moment perfectly. The raised hand to summon the flight attendant. The forced politeness masking entitlement. And then, Margaret's fatal mistake, the quiet but deliberate words, "I don't feel safe." That was all it took. A few seconds of footage. A clip short enough to be shared, replayed, dissected. The world didn't need to know Margaret personally to judge her. They saw the video, and that was enough. Within hours, her face was plastered across news articles, her name trending on social media alongside words like privilege, entitlement, and racist. She had thought she was wielding power. Instead, she had become a lesson, another cautionary tale of what happens when outdated prejudices collide with a world that no longer tolerates them. Because in the digital age, racism doesn't stay hidden. It gets recorded, exposed, and held accountable. And no amount of status, wealth, or influence could erase what the world had seen. In today's digital age, every action carries weight, and accountability is no longer confined to boardrooms or courtrooms. It happens in real time, for the world to see. Margaret Whitmore's story is a stark reminder that the privilege and influence some have long relied upon can disappear in an instant when For decades, power often rested in the hands of those who knew how to manipulate perception, who understood the subtle ways to shift narratives in their favor. A simple complaint, a carefully placed doubt, or an unspoken assumption could change the course of someone else's future. But those days are fading. The world is more connected than ever, and technology has given voice to those who were once unheard. This shift is not just about social media or viral videos, it's about a deeper societal change. People are less willing to turn a blind eye to injustice. The structures that once protected certain individuals from consequences are being dismantled, and actions are judged not by status, but by integrity. For many, this may feel unsettling, even unfair. But at its core, it is a call to self-awareness. The lessons of this moment are clear: treat others with respect, assume the best rather than the worst, and understand that no one is above accountability. Because in the end, true power does not come from privilege, it comes from doing what is right. And that is something no viral video can take away.